Have you ever wondered why the person who pulled away, who seemed so distant and avoidant, suddenly comes back around, missing the very ex they seemed so relieved to leave? If you're the anxious one in the relationship, this can feel like emotional whiplash. But there's a deeper psychology at play that explains it all, and once you understand it, you'll never feel powerless again. Avoidants often crave space. That's how they've learned to feel safe, by creating distance. When they're in a relationship, especially with someone more emotionally expressive or anxious, it can feel overwhelming. The constant communication, the emotional availability, the desire for reassurance, all of that, to them, feels like pressure. So they pull away. They create space, not because they don't care, but because closeness feels like a threat to their autonomy. In the moment, that space feels like freedom. It feels like breathing room. The relationship starts to feel heavy, like something they have to manage, and their instinct is to escape it. So they leave, convinced they'll feel better on the other side. And at first, they do. There's relief. No more emotional tension. No more difficult conversations. No more feeling like they have to constantly show up when they don't fully understand what they're feeling themselves. It's quiet. It's peaceful. It's what they thought they needed. But here's what happens next, and it always catches them off guard. Time passes. That space they once craved, it starts to shift. At first, it feels liberating. They do what they want, when they want. There's no emotional pressure. But slowly, that freedom begins to morph into something else. The silence becomes noticeable. The emotional weight they once tried to avoid starts to come back, not because of someone else, but because of the thoughts that start creeping in when there's no one there to distract them. The very thing they ran from, the connection, the emotional closeness, the presence of someone who truly saw them, starts to feel like something they miss. They don't always realize it right away, but they feel it. In the quiet moments, in the spaces where their new freedom doesn't feel exciting anymore, where the days start to blend together and the lack of emotional connection begins to feel like emptiness rather than relief. The anxious partner, in many cases, created a kind of emotional safety net. They were expressive, they cared, they checked in, they wanted to understand, and while the avoidant couldn't always handle that energy in the moment, it was giving them something deeper, a sense of being emotionally held. And now, with that gone, the avoidant begins to feel the contrast. They don't always label it correctly. They might not say, "I miss the emotional security," but they do miss how it felt to have someone genuinely care, to have someone show up, to have someone willing to work through things rather than walk away. That safety, the one they couldn't appreciate when it was right in front of them, starts to become more and more valuable in hindsight. Avoidants often struggle to process their emotions in real time. They suppress, they compartmentalize, they try to stay in control. But with distance, when the emotional noise settles, they have space to reflect. And that reflection often brings back memories of the anxious partner, not the arguments or the tension, but the calm moments, the care, the support, the warmth. Suddenly, the things that felt suffocating now feel like comfort. The need for space they once fought so hard for starts to feel like loneliness. And that's the shift. That's when missing sets in. Not because they want the exact relationship back, but because the safety and emotional grounding they received from the anxious partner is no longer present. The avoidant begins to realize that distance didn't solve everything, that freedom doesn't always mean fulfillment, that space might feel safe, but it's not always satisfying. Time has a fascinating way of altering our perception, especially when it comes to emotional experiences. In the immediate aftermath of a breakup, particularly for someone with an avoidant attachment style, there's often a sense of relief. They've escaped what they perceived as emotional intensity, pressure, or demands. The relationship may have felt like too much, too close, too consuming, too emotionally involved. So when they walk away, the first sensation is space, and with that space comes the ability to breathe. But what often goes unnoticed is how time quietly rearranges the emotional furniture in their mind. The moments that felt overwhelming start to fade. The conflicts and misunderstandings that loomed large in their decision to leave become distant and less defined. It's not that the problems disappeared, it's that memory naturally softens the edges of pain, especially when you're no longer actively confronting it. Avoidants are typically people who disconnect from emotions to protect themselves. They prioritize independence. They feel safer when they're not emotionally reliant on others. So when a relationship ends, they quickly shift their focus. They distract themselves with work, hobbies, new interests, or even new people. They fill their time, they keep moving, they avoid sitting still for too long, because stillness invites thoughts and emotions they'd rather not examine. But even as they distract themselves, the mind starts to replay certain parts of the relationship, and the parts it replays aren't always the hard ones. In fact, more often than not, it's the warm memories, the light ones, the late-night conversations, the laughter, the comfort of being understood, the feeling of someone genuinely caring. These moments start to resurface more than the arguments or the emotional confrontations. This isn't accidental, it's psychological. Our brains aren't wired to hold on to emotional discomfort forever. With time, the mind prioritizes emotional regulation. It puts distance between us and the intensity of what we once felt. This is especially true for avoidants who already lean toward minimizing emotional impact. As time passes, the emotional weight they once felt in the relationship doesn't hit as hard. What they start to feel instead is the absence of care, of familiarity, of emotional safety, of connection. And because the anxious partner often poured a great deal of love and energy into the relationship, that absence can feel even starker. The anxious person might have been expressive, emotionally generous, quick to forgive, quick to understand. Those qualities, once perceived as intense or overwhelming, now take on a different tone. They begin to feel rare, precious, even comforting. What once felt like emotional overload now begins to look a lot like love. But this realization doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly, often triggered by quiet moments, a familiar song, an old photo, a memory that appears out of nowhere. And with each of these moments, the emotional content of the past relationship is reprocessed. The harshness fades, the sweetness lingers. They don't remember every argument or every moment of stress. They remember the steady presence, the way the anxious partner listened, the effort they made, the support they offered during difficult times. They remember how it felt to be cared for, even if they couldn't accept it fully at the time. And what's most powerful is that this shift in memory doesn't require new information. It just requires time, space, and the quiet that comes with not having that person around anymore. The same silence that once felt like peace starts to act as a mirror. It reflects back the parts of the relationship that mattered, that gave meaning, that made them feel something real, even if they didn't know how to hold on to it when they had it. Avoidants are often thought of as emotionally detached, but that's not entirely accurate. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they've learned to manage emotional discomfort by creating distance. Somewhere along the way, they internalize the belief that too much closeness equals danger. Danger of being overwhelmed, misunderstood, or ultimately abandoned. So they protect themselves by staying on the edge of emotional involvement. But even from that edge, they feel. They crave connection, just like anyone else. They just don't trust it. And in many cases, they don't fully understand what they're receiving in the relationship until they step away from it. One of the things the avoidant partner often doesn't realize they're receiving until it's gone is validation. Real, consistent, emotional validation. This is something anxious partners tend to offer freely, sometimes excessively. When they love, they reassure, they affirm, they support, they empathize. They're emotionally tuned in, constantly noticing subtle shifts, asking questions like, "Are you okay?" or "Did that upset you?" They check in, they listen deeply, and they care with intensity. And while that level of attentiveness can feel overwhelming to the avoidant partner in the moment, it's also feeding something in them they didn't know was starving. The avoidant person may have grown up in environments where emotional expression was either discouraged or ignored. Validation was conditional, rare, or non-existent. So when they enter a relationship with someone who provides that emotional reflection, who sees them, who hears them, who affirms their feelings, it touches something unfamiliar but deeply needed. At first, they don't always know what to do with it. It can feel intrusive or confusing. They may even push it away or downplay it, but it still lands somewhere. It still leaves an imprint. Over time, the anxious partner's validation becomes part of the emotional rhythm of the relationship. It shows up in everyday ways: a good morning text, a compliment, a check-in during a rough day, a patient conversation when things get hard. These gestures may seem small in isolation, but together they form a steady emotional undercurrent. They build a space where the avoidant person is emotionally held, even if they resist being fully open. And this is what gets missed most when the relationship ends. When that validation is no longer there, there's a subtle but powerful void. At first, the avoidant may enjoy the quiet. There's no one asking them how they feel, no one probing into their emotional state, no one offering interpretations of their moods. But gradually, that absence becomes noticeable. Not just because the anxious partner is no longer physically present, but because the emotional reflection is gone. There's no one holding up that mirror anymore, no one showing them who they are in moments of vulnerability, strength, or struggle. They don't hear, "I see you," or "that makes sense" anymore. And whether they acknowledge it or not, that silence begins to echo. Validation is one of the deepest human needs. It's not about praise or flattery. It's about being seen and known. And anxious partners, for all their intensity, are often incredibly skilled at making their partner feel seen. That's something avoidants may not realize they depended on, until it's no longer there. Until the compliments stop, until the check-ins stop, until there's no one on the other end of a bad day to remind them they matter. And that's when they begin to miss something they never fully appreciated in the moment. Not just the person, but the feeling that person created inside of them. The feeling of being noticed, affirmed, and emotionally grounded in a way they didn't even realize they needed. Avoidants often excel at filling their lives with distractions. When they end a relationship, especially one that felt emotionally intense or demanding, their instinct is to regain a sense of control. That control often comes in the form of busyness. They throw themselves into work, personal goals, hobbies, new experiences, or even superficial connections. They don't sit still because stillness invites thoughts, and those thoughts are tied to emotions they've spent years learning how to suppress. So they move quickly, filling their days with tasks, numbing themselves with stimulation, convincing themselves that they're doing just fine, that the choice to leave was right, and that the discomfort they felt in the relationship is now behind them. At first, the distractions work. They bring a sense of momentum. There's relief in not having to engage emotionally every day, in not having to navigate someone else's needs, or confront one's own discomfort with intimacy. The world feels lighter when no one is expecting emotional presence from you. The avoidant enjoys the autonomy, the sense that they can live on their own terms again. But what they don't anticipate is that distractions have a shelf life. Eventually, even the most exciting routine loses its edge. The noise gets quieter, the novelty fades, and what remains is the silence they thought they wanted. This is the moment avoidants rarely see coming. The stillness that felt like a sanctuary starts to reveal something else entirely. It begins to feel empty, not peaceful, not calm, just quiet and lonely. The avoidance of emotional depth comes at a cost, and when the external distractions no longer satisfy, the emotional truth starts to surface. That truth often includes missing the connection they left behind, but not just any connection, the specific one they had with the anxious partner who brought emotional intensity into their world. Because for all the overwhelm that came with that closeness, it also brought meaning. There was emotional color. There were deep conversations, vulnerable exchanges, a shared emotional landscape, and now there's none of that. It's in the quiet moments. When the avoidant comes home to an empty space, when they scroll through their phone and there's no message waiting, when they sit at dinner and no one is across the table, it begins to sink in. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, like a drip of realization. They start to feel a lack of emotional nourishment. They start to notice that all the external activity isn't filling them the way that connection once did. The partner who once felt like too much now begins to feel like the missing piece. They start remembering not the emotional weight, but the emotional presence. Someone was there. Someone cared deeply. Someone offered affection, attention, concern. Someone reached into their world with genuine interest and didn't ask for anything more than emotional engagement in return. And that's what's gone. The avoidant might not know how to name what they're feeling. They may not admit it out loud, but internally there's a tug, a nostalgia for what used to be there, a curiosity about how that person is doing, a wondering if maybe they gave up something that had more value than they realized. All of this grows in the absence of distraction. When there's nothing pulling their attention outward, they begin to feel the loss inward. The absence becomes a teacher. It starts showing them what they couldn't see when they were emotionally flooded, not just who the other person was, but what the relationship brought into their life. And now, without that emotional anchor, the avoidant floats, untethered, disconnected. And it's in that disconnection that they begin to miss the very thing they once ran from. When an avoidant begins to miss their ex, it's easy to assume that they've had some grand epiphany, that they've finally realized how much the person meant to them, that they're ready to reconnect on a deeper level, that they want to rebuild what was lost. But that's rarely what's actually happening beneath the surface. What's happening is more nuanced and more rooted in emotional craving than emotional growth. Avoidants don't typically miss people in the way most expect. They don't sit in reflection about the relationship's potential or suddenly become ready to show up in the way they once couldn't. What they often miss is a feeling, not a commitment, a sense of closeness, not the responsibilities that come with maintaining it. Avoidants are deeply uncomfortable with emotional dependency. It's not because they don't need connection, they do, but because connection feels like a trap. It brings with it expectations, emotional labor, and the vulnerability of being seen. So when they're in a relationship, even with someone loving and emotionally generous, they feel tension. There's a push-pull dynamic that constantly plays out. They crave intimacy but fear what it demands. The anxious partner tends to provide warmth, presence, and emotional security. That makes the avoidant feel safe and seen, but it also makes them feel exposed. They retreat, not because they don't value the relationship, but because they don't know how to navigate the emotional responsibility that comes with being close to someone who wants to connect on a real level. Once the relationship ends, those emotional responsibilities vanish. The avoidant is no longer accountable for someone else's emotional needs. No more intense conversations. No more moments where they have to answer the question, "What are you feeling?" On the surface, this feels like freedom. But over time, what sets in is an unexpected wave of emotional emptiness. Not necessarily loneliness in the traditional sense, but a lack of something that was once there. Something warm, consistent, and emotionally rich. And so the avoidant starts to miss the emotional experience they had. The good mornings, the texts out of nowhere, the way their anxious partner lit up when they were happy or leaned in when they were struggling. They miss being on the receiving end of emotional energy. They miss being cared for, but that doesn't mean they want to step back into the emotional demands that care came with. It's entirely possible for an avoidant to miss the sweetness of the connection without wanting the responsibility of sustaining it. They miss being thought about, missed, wanted. They miss the comfort and the emotional rhythm of the relationship. But what they often want is to feel that way again, without changing their patterns or opening themselves to the work that true intimacy requires. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant may reach out, send a message, or linger in the ex's world just enough to spark a response. They're not necessarily trying to rekindle the full relationship. They're often seeking a hit of emotional connection, a reminder that they're still remembered, still missed, still emotionally significant to someone. This is where confusion sets in for the anxious partner, because when someone who left you comes back around and says they miss you, it's natural to assume they're ready to give what they couldn't before. But in many cases, they miss the feeling you gave them, not the mutual commitment it would take to rebuild something real. They miss being emotionally fed, but not necessarily being emotionally available in return. This is not because they're manipulative, but because their emotional wiring makes closeness feel threatening even when they crave it. So they orbit, getting close enough to feel the warmth without stepping into the fire of true vulnerability. They long for the emotional shelter you once provided, but they haven't necessarily grown into someone who knows how to live inside that shelter without breaking it down again.